is Mike McDermott, and I'm an American soldier, although long retired. My purpose in these videos is to introduce you to the combat history of the United States Army, as told by the stories in this manuscript, which I recently completed, entitled Campaign Streamers of the United States Army, A Battle History of Sacrifice and Courage. The sacrifice and courage of the soldiers who have worn the Army uniform for over 200 years. And what I'm going to do is a autobiographic sketch that will introduce you to my service, which spanned 32 years, enlisted and commissioned, and more specific, my combat experience, which allows me to do the research and tell these stories with a certain insight. I was born and raised in South Dakota. My parents, children of the Great Depression, both went to college for 2 years. And they were required to then drop out of school and go to work. And it had to do with the changing economic conditions of their families. And of course, during the Depression, those were problems that a lot of people had. They were convinced that higher education provided the ladder for upward mobility in this society, economic and social mobility. And that was a lesson that I, my two brothers, and my two sisters all took on board. In fact, we all finished college and we all did some post-baccalaureate work or training of some kind. When I finished high school, I went down to the University of South Dakota for 2 years. And I must admit, I was a dismal failure. I understood the requirements and I knew I could do it, but the fact is there were lots of distractions and I simply didn't have the maturity to transition into a university environment successfully at that point. I knew that I needed to take a recess. I wanted a little bit of an adventure. My parents were very upset because they were concerned that if I dropped out of school, I'd never return. I knew that I would, and I did. After I served a 3-year enlistment, a 3-year hitch in the Army. I enlisted airborne unassigned, which meant that I would be a paratrooper in an airborne outfit. After basic training and advanced individual training, I found myself at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, the home of the famous 101st Airborne Division. And that's where I went to jump school. The jump school cadre at Fort Campbell were all sergeants, NCOs, non-commissioned officers, sergeants of the 101st Airborne Division, and they were insistent on the physical conditioning of their students. What that meant in real terms is that there was lots of physical training and lots of running. The first 2 weeks of that 3-week course were committed to training, how to handle our equipment, how to get it on properly, how to get into an airplane, how to go through the hookup sequence to prepare to jump, how to get out of it, and how to get on the ground without getting injured. Their mission was to prepare us to join parachute infantry units so that we could function as paratroopers. The 3rd week was comprised of 5 parachute jumps. And following the 5th jump, I was very impressed by the fact that our instructors formed us up in a formation on the drop zone. And they began to pin parachute wings on our uniforms as we stood at attention in the grass of the drop zone. They demonstrated to us that our status had changed. We were no longer their students. We had been invited to join their brotherhood of paratroopers. And at that point, we joined various units of the 101st Airborne Division. In my case, it was the 187. The 187 Regiment was a well-known unit, and it still is, I joined that unit in 1961, 10 years after they had made the 2 parachute jumps, the 2 combat jumps in Korea. And what was noteworthy to me was how few soldiers in that unit were combat veterans. In a period of 10 years, the combat experience had simply dissipated, almost disappeared. All those soldiers either got out of the Army or they went someplace else. At any rate, I and my fellow soldiers were, by and large, not combat experienced. Now, there were a few NCOs in the battle group that were Korean War vets, but they were few and far between. The battle group commander, Colonel, was an old World War II paratrooper. And there were several others in the division, to include the division commander, a Major General named Westmoreland, who became better known during the Vietnam War, and the division command sergeant major, a man named Huff, who had made a number of combat jumps during the Second World War and was the recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. At any rate, the 187 has spent years in Japan, and it, in fact, was the first Army unit to move into Japan following the Emperor's message of surrender. The cap that I'm wearing is marked with the 187 logo. This red logo is a traditional Japanese gate, and the 187 then and today, still an outfit in the 101st Airborne Division, has that Torii Japanese gate logo on their helmets and on the bumpers of their vehicles. And in fact, the greeting in the 187, Rakusan, is Japanese for parachutist or parachute soldier. My initial job was as a machine gunner. But by the time my 3-year enlistment was up, I had moved up in the world. I'd been promoted to buck sergeant, 3-stripe sergeant, the lowest non-commissioned officer grade, and I had become the machine gun squad leader in my platoon in the company that I had originally joined after jump school. But when my 3 years was up, I was out of the Army and back to college. And I must say, I was a much better student than I had been the first time. I had acquired some of the maturity and some sense of responsibility that's necessary to move into a university environment successfully. And I enjoyed school much more than I had the previous time. Now, at that point, the American Army was becoming more deeply involved in Vietnam, and I wanted to get involved as well. So I went over to the ROTC department, introduced myself as a prior service guy, and they were kind enough to allow me to complete the last 2 years of advanced ROTC training. And I was commissioned a second lieutenant of infantry in the regular Army in the summer of 1966. And I found myself right back on jump status. I went right back to the 101. At that point, 1 brigade of the division had been in Vietnam for a couple of years, and the other 2 brigades and the division headquarters were preparing to deploy. And I had orders to go, but I did a detour, TDY, to the Ranger School down at Fort Benning, Georgia. Now that was it's a 10-week course when I did it. And it was a demanding experience, and it has always been, and it continues to be, a demanding accomplishment. The non-commissioned officer instructors and the junior officer instructors in the Ranger School insist on a rigorous program. The first week, which we call 0 week, everybody redid all of the qualification requirements to go to the Ranger School. Now, everybody had already done that, supposedly, at their home station. But the Ranger School put everybody through it again, and that included lots of running, lots of physical exercise, lots of PT, and redoing the swimming qualification course, and not getting very much sleep. In fact, we were in barracks for that first phase at Fort Benning. The lights went out at midnight and came on again at 3 a.m. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, at 10 minutes later, everybody was in a formation outside. It was dark. The big lights were on. It reminded me of movies that I'd seen of POW camps. The Ranger School cadre were active with their inspections and their suggestions, and there was a strenuous PT period before breakfast, and of course nobody ate until they'd accomplished the required number of chin-ups outside the mess hall door. And under any circumstance, there wasn't very much time to eat breakfast before the day commenced in a more serious way. The second phase of Ranger School up in the mountains, North Georgia, near Dahlonega, Georgia, and the third phase in the swamps down in Florida. About 1/3 of all of the soldiers who start the Ranger School graduate. 2/3 don't make it. They are all people who were qualified and who started, but they didn't make it for one reason or another. Some were injured, others simply quit. And the 1/3 who graduated knew that they had accomplished something pretty serious. That hasn't changed. A few years ago, one of my sons did the Ranger course, and his experience was very, very similar. 1/3, roughly 1/3 of his class intake were presented with the Ranger tab. At any rate, once I completed the course, I was off to Vietnam. A lean and mean infantry lieutenant, ready to win the war. I joined the 2nd Battalion 327 in the 1st Brigade of the 101st, and I served 3 years in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division, either as a platoon leader or rifle platoon leader, a infantry company commander, and in one case I commanded the division Pathfinder unit. I had previously commanded the Army's Pathfinder School down at Fort Benning, and I was able to introduce some of the training that we were doing in the course to the Pathfinders who were serving in Vietnam. At any rate, when my 3rd year was up, the division was packing up to come home. I was not ready to come back. The American War was over, but everybody who was there knew that the Vietnam War was far from over. And so I extended and I joined the advisory team 162. The soldiers assigned to that advisory team served with the Vietnamese Paratroop Division, primarily senior NCOs and junior officers who served with battalions as advisors with the Vietnamese Airborne Division, and I joined the 5th Battalion, which in the Vietnamese Army was a famous outfit. The 5th Battalion jumped into Dien Bien Phu, not once, but twice. They were part of the initial operation in 1954 during the French Indochina War, the first Indochina War. And once they were jumped onto the Dien Bien Phu Plateau and began to establish a series of strong points, the Vietnamese enemy, the Viet Minh, were not in a strength that had been anticipated, and so once the runway had been improved and completed, the 5th Battalion was flown back to Hanoi, where they shoot up and they made a combat jump into an ongoing battle in the Red River Delta. And once that fight was over, they were taken back to Hanoi, were plussed up with replacements, put on their parachutes, and they jumped into Dien Bien Phu at the height of the battle. They were the only outfit that jumped into that place twice. And they returned just in time for the final Viet Minh triumph. The French units were overrun and destroyed, and the remnants were surrendered, and they were marched off to POW camps up on the Chinese border. By the time that the Geneva Accords came into effect, they were then allowed to go down to South Vietnam, the new nation of South Vietnam, and join the South Vietnamese Army. When I joined the 5th Battalion in 1972, we were in the midst of the Easter Offensive, which was a big deal. The North Vietnamese invaded South Vietnam right across the demilitarized zone and out of Laos up north with big conventional battalions of infantry, tanks, and field artillery. They also did an invasion of South Vietnam out of Cambodia, and they surrounded the province town of An Loc, which is located on the Cambodian border in northeast of Saigon. That was the fight that I got involved in. A third North Vietnamese invasion occurred into the highlands, which is about halfway between the other two. And it was a serious invasion, and it stretched the South Vietnamese to the breaking point. The 5th Battalion and 2 other airborne battalions, plus an artillery battery, were lifted. Well, initially we tried to open the road from Saigon to An Loc, and we were unable to do it. 2 enemy divisions had surrounded An Loc and had it in a death grip. A third enemy division had cut all the roads into that province capital, and we were unable to break through that force. And so we were lifted by helicopter into the outskirts of An Loc. One of the battalions and the artillery battery established a little fire base. The other 2 battalions fought our way into the city and joined the garrison. And we were there for some time. It was a do or die situation. All of our supplies came in by parachute, thanks to the United States Air Force. Because helicopters had stopped flying up there, the result of the enemy introducing heat-seeking missiles, we were unable to medevac our wounded. And those who could continue to operate were bandaged up and stayed with their platoons and with their companies. Those who could not were put in a holding area, a medical holding area, to do as best they could. And of course, we were not able to receive any replacements. Over a period of time, our casualties increased to the point where the battalion commander was forced to do what his predecessor had done in 1954 Dien Bien Phu. When the battalion at that time was whittled down to a certain point, he reorganized and formed 2 small rifle companies before they were destroyed. In 1972, our casualties were similar, and the battalion commander, suffering serious angst, he did not want to do it because he really was concerned about an outcome similar to what the battalion had suffered in 1954, but nonetheless, because of casualties, he was forced to reorganize 2 bob-tailed rifle companies and a headquarters element because we only had enough sergeants and enough company-grade officers left to command and control 2 rifle companies. Our outcome turned out to be serious, but it was not disastrous. All of the fire support that we received was delivered by aircraft. not just the Air Force, but also carrier-based Navy fighters and by Marine Corps jets. And they did the ground attack, kept the enemy off our back, and kept us alive. The Air Force B-52 fleet was also diverted from their traditional strategic targets to support us. And they laid down a carpet of bombs all around the town of An Loc, and in some cases pretty close. And the upshot was the enemy was hammered to the point where they began to disengage and move back into their sanctuaries in Cambodia, which allowed the Vietnamese airborne battalions to fight their way out of An Loc and back onto the highway. Now, only 2 battalions were left, the 5th Battalion and the 8th Battalion. The 6th Battalion, which had established the fire base with the artillery battery, had been overrun and destroyed. The battalion commander, the American advisor, and a handful of paratroopers had conducted an escape and evasion, running through the jungle and the rice paddies, chased by the North Vietnamese until they were fortuitously located and picked up by helicopter. Now, that battalion commander and his little handful of soldiers provided the nucleus for rebuilding that battalion, which was done pretty quickly. It was done partially by emptying all the Vietnamese military prisons of airborne qualified soldiers, which gives an indication of the makeup of the soldiers in those paratroop battalions. Tough, hard-bitten, hardcore bunch of people. They had a real disdain for the enemy. There was no retirement program for Vietnamese paratroopers. Retirement simply wasn't part of their world. They fought and they engaged the enemy and they killed their enemy until their intent was until the war was over, and in fact that's exactly what they did. When we pulled out of An Loc, my tour was up and I returned to the United States. Those battalions, however, were taken back to Saigon, where they were plussed up with replacements, re-equipped. There was a short training exercise, and they were then flown up to the north end of the country to go back into the battle. Quang Tri was the name of the provincial capital up north that they next got involved in. I was very impressed by the attitude and the behavior of Vietnamese paratroopers. Now, I had served with American paratroop units for 3 years in combat. American paratroopers are not shy. They do not hesitate to engage the enemy. And they take casualties. But it's nothing like what those Vietnamese paratroopers, the life they lived. They routinely stood up and attacked into enemy positions, oftentimes with no fire support. And they took horrendous casualties. And they expected to. And that's the way they lived their soldierly life. In one case, while we were still defending the perimeter in An Loc, my battalion was ordered to reposition. And we were under attack at the time, and in order to do that, the battalion designated one of the companies as a detachment left in contact. That company was required to hold while the rest of the battalion moved. I'd studied the theory of the detachment left in contact, but I really didn't fully appreciate the implications. That battalion move covered maybe 400 or 500 yards. And I didn't want to move with them initially because I had aircraft stacked up to put in airstrikes. And I wanted to get that accomplished before I moved. The battalion commander grabbed me. We were laying on the ground under fire, and he grabbed me, and we're right next to each other, and he had to shout to tell me to not wait very long before I got up and moved and rejoined him. Because he said, today, this company is going to die. And they did. I stayed with them until I got those airstrikes in. And it was kind of a touch and go deal. What I saw as I got ready to go was some of the Vietnamese paratroopers near me throwing off their steel helmets and pulling on their paratrooper berets. They intended to embrace their mission. They were going to stay, and they accepted that they were going to die right there, right then. The berets that I saw them pull on were these. This is my beret, which Vietnamese airborne wore, and the Americans who served with them. When I left Vietnam, I threw this in a duffel bag and brought it home with me. And this is how it's worn. My goodness, it's a little tight. Either the material has shrunk up a little bit, or my head's getting bigger. I hope that's not the case. At any rate, this is the maroon beret that has become standard headgear for paratroopers around the world. And in fact, the 82nd Airborne Division adopted this paratroop beret some years ago. At any rate, when I left the battle in 1972 and returned to the United States to pick up my peacetime career, 3 years later, the enemy overran Saigon and all of South Vietnam. While the South Vietnamese lost their American sponsor, the North Vietnamese continued to be resupplied by their communist allies, China and the Soviet Union. But in 1975, with the surrender of South Vietnam, a number of the airborne battalions who were engaged, all of them were in the field and all of them were fighting. Several of them refused to surrender, as they were ordered to do. And they backed into the jungle, and in some cases, they backed into Cambodia and continued to fight until they ran out of ammunition and were destroyed. A few of the survivors eventually showed up farther east in Thailand. Or if their surrender was accepted, they went into POW camps, or what the communists referred to as re-education camps. And if they survived that experience, eventually they were released, and in many cases, they joined boats to get out, and later on were part of a program that allowed Vietnamese to leave South Vietnam. So, the next part B of this video, is going to pick up when I return to the United States. In the meantime, God bless each and every one of us and our America.